Welcome to Chapter 8, Middle Adulthood, as we continue our journey through the voyage of adulthood. Here we can see the main Erikson psychosocial challenge, generativity versus stagnation. We all know what stagnation means. It's a slowdown, it's a plateau, it sounds bad, we want to avoid it. The opposite of that is generativity. It is making a contribution, it is making a legacy, it is making a lasting impact. Also, get your AARP applications ready. The American Association of Retired Persons is always looking for more members and looking to increase its influence. So don't worry, they will find you once you reach middle adulthood and approach potential retirement ages. We're going to talk about some areas of adulthood that do grow, although we'll also focus on a lot of aspects of adulthood in which growth is good, but we're also trying to minimize loss. And loss is something that, at least if we have the right perspective, we know is a natural, normal, expected thing, and it's not to try to avoid losing completely our cognitive faculties or our physical decline. It is to minimize the rate or the extent of loss. So first of all, let's talk about the most common ages that we refer to with regard to middle adulthood. So the end of early adulthood, ages 40 to 45, and again, earlier, 50 years ago, maybe 40 was the typical boundary of over the hill. 45 might be the more contemporary or current boundary. Now, we also have the issue of the later or outer boundary of middle adulthood, 60 to 65. What happens to a lot of people around these age ranges? Well, if you guessed retirement, you are correct. And so retirement is typically the boundary or the passageway from middle adulthood to older or later adulthood. But of course, given many trends in the last decade or so, 60 seems to be a very early age for retirement in most occupations. And so 65 and possibly even into mid to late 60s or even 70 would be the boundary that some others would consider as the a boundary for later adulthood. Also, we talk about what does it mean? What's the experience of middle adulthood? As Jung would put it, if birth for us is the morning or waking up, Carl Jung, a famous contemporary of Sigmund Freud, would describe middle adulthood as the afternoon of life, sort of a winding down of the day, involving some relaxation, but still plenty of time for productivity and making a contribution. As I mentioned before, we have the perspective generally of gains versus losses, reviewing from early adulthood, especially that early chunk of early adulthood called emerging adulthood, up to age 26 or 28, we are focusing mostly on gains. It's amazing how the body and the mind is still increasing its function, its efficiency. Then there's this kind of period from the end of emerging adulthood through the end of early adulthood, where things are starting to decline, but the rate of decline is so slow that it feels like it's not very noticeable. Then, of course, and I'm experiencing this as well, once you approach the boundary for early adulthood and transition into middle adulthood, typically age 40, maybe a little bit earlier for some, maybe a little bit later for others, we start to notice the losses, right? The body becomes more sore. It's tough to stay as energetic. It is tough mentally to focus on multiple things or multitask at the same time. And so, as we talked about before, losses are more noticeable. And if you anticipate them, we'll talk about some strategies where you can, we're having the idea of flattening the curve for other applications today, but you can flatten the rate of loss that will happen in middle adulthood and continue on into later adulthood for the next chapter. One thing that I wanted to cover in this chapter, I've saved you from many of these technical aspects or studies in other chapters, but I really wanted to focus on some good studies. One reason for that is because the field of lifespan, I think, is commendable because it has focused not just on childhood and child development, which historically developmental psychology has much overemphasized. So I think this class reflects a nice recent trend, and this is only in the last probably 20, 30 years, where we haven't, instead of the previous version perspective of saying, well, all the important development happens in childhood, adolescence. Once you're in adulthood, there's some interesting stuff, but the most important stuff is done, except until we get to death and dying and what causes us to decay. The perspective we're taking here is that a lot of important stuff is happening in adulthood, and the problem is a lot of researchers just haven't been interested enough in exploring it to really show us or have data for the interesting stuff that's happening. And one of the best studies that I can think of in most of science is what's called the MIDUS, and this stands for Midlife in the U.S. As you can see, there's a website through the University of Wisconsin page, and I'll provide a link to that we can explore that more. And Wisconsin was certainly one academic institution that had a lot of influence with MIDUS, but it was a multi-college, multi-university study. So it's a really good example of faculty and universities across the country joining up for one common goal. And basically the idea was, we don't have much good data on the experience of moving through adulthood for U.S. Americans, U.S. citizens, and we need that. And so first version of MIDUS, you can see MIDUS 1 took place in the mid-90s. You start with a good sample, and here's a good example of how research starts. Identify the target group, adulthood, right? And start with the easiest way to do it, which is cross-sectional, right? One point in time, let's get a big sample from a wide age group, and then we can compare some differences, right? So we're looking primarily for behavioral, psychological, psychosocial factors, right? If you want demographics, you could just go to the U.S. Census. The U.S. Census was not asking things about how psychologically healthy or unhealthy people were. They weren't asking about potential living arrangements and what normal types of psychosocial or emotional or the experience of aging. So kind of softer, emotional personality types of questions that we just didn't have a lot of data for. What's also good is they started with a subsample of these 7,000 people specifically for twin research. So you can do some genetic comparisons of twins versus just siblings. And of course, this allows for nature-nurture, the impact of genetics analysis without actually having genetic information. You don't have their genes, but you don't have their genome, but you do have this twin comparison. So another aspect of good research is that, yes, you have one good start and a big data set, which lots of researchers have gone back into and reanalyzed and tried to look at different patterns. And then you follow that up, right? What's the next step after this good start? And so MIDUS 2 represents a decade later the longitudinal follow-up, right? So we're starting with a cross-sectional study, and then we're trying to follow up with them longitudinally over time later on. So basically, this started as a cross-sectional study. Then you add the longitudinal component, combine these two, and what have you got? You have the gold standard sequential study. Once again, very expensive, time-consuming. You can't just do a good one with this kind of sample with one researcher. It takes collaboration with many researchers. MIDUS 2, instead of mailing out surveys, built on that, but actually brought people in for cognitive tests. So we're giving them measures of cognitive functioning, as we'll talk about in a little bit, fluid, crystallized intelligence, and also some neuroscience, some brain scan, and some actual blood draws, physical health measures. So once again, I really think that Midas is a great example of collaborative research, especially in an area that we didn't have much data about. And so thanks to Midas, we know a lot more about the average American citizen's experience of progressing through the aspects of adulthood. Looking specifically at physical changes, I will come back to my bank analogy for health. Basically, if you built a strong nest egg, and it doesn't have to be huge when you start, but basic, simple changes in early adulthood, building a strong physical health foundation in early adulthood, such as diet, regular exercise, you will have more to draw on when in middle adulthood there's an increased likelihood that physically something goes wrong. It could be something as simple as throwing out a shoulder or a back, or something as serious as cancer. The better health foundation that you've had in the decades leading up to that increase your chances of easily or more successfully transitioning through that physical challenge. A previous book I used the phrase, the more people do, the more people can do. And so this is basic physical activity. The more physical activity, especially cardiovascular, regular exercise, and nutrition, the more you'll be able to achieve in middle adulthood. You'll flatten that plateau, reduce the rate of decline. I think of the character Bill Murray played in the movie Lost in Translation. Basically, he was in middle adulthood and he had given up on life. Nothing was interesting to him, and it took meeting Scarlett Johansson to even kind of wake him up. But the key here is that waking him up can't undo all the damage that he did by being lazy and not committed to his wife. And so this character in middle adulthood experienced a lot of regret. And it's only once he woke up that he realized the amount of regret that he had for leading an unproductive adulthood. Let's stick more specifically to exact physical changes. Cardiovascular system, we see blood vessels thickening and hardening. This is called hypertension. And so, again, this is going to be something that most people will experience, and we just want to reduce the amount of hypertension that we experience compared to early adulthood. We also have sarcopenia. This is muscle loss. This explains why professional athletes rarely can compete into their 40s and beyond. It's because despite the access to top shelf athletic care, physical therapy, the natural loss of muscle is something that really nature is going to make sure happens, right? And that's why even if we look at, for example, professional wrestling, probably use of legal and illegal supplements, you rarely see wrestlers in their 50s who are still super muscular. And then if you do, you wonder how many things are they having to do to offset the natural muscle loss. We also have what's known as osteopenia. This is sort of the step before what you may have heard of osteoporosis. We typically think of osteoporosis as something that happens in women, but men are also at risk for osteopenia. And so this is a loss of bone. And once again, we want to prevent the rate of loss. So nutrition, this is where, for example, if adolescents and early adults don't have healthy diets, maybe you don't notice drastic changes. They don't feel like they are missing out on anything or experiencing definite health loss because of that. But it might put them at early risk for noticeable bone loss once we get to early adulthood. And then finally, we have visual and also auditory changes. We'll just focus on the visual here. Presbyopia, this is where the lens in the eye cannot accommodate or bend properly. And so here's where, like me, I've been able to go, luckily, most of my life without the need for glasses or contacts. But I'm at that age where I have to accept reality. I've been lucky, but odds are very strong that I won't be able to continue without any assistance. And so I remember my uncle at one point saying in his 40s, well, I used to be able to read the fine print, and now I just don't. He was still denying that his eyes were changing, and instead of accepting that fact, getting glasses, being able to read the fine print, he just decided he didn't care. We also have sleep and hormonal changes. Basically, we sleep less during the night, and it might feel distressing. I used to get my straight 8, no problem, and now I get 6, and it's really kind of causing me anxiety. Here's where introduction of naps could be useful. And of course, hormonal changes. The big one for women is, of course, toward the end of middle adulthood, the introduction of menopause. Also, we can have early menopause from things ranging from chemotherapy to also other drug treatments. And the key is, if we know that hormonal changes will be happening, and they can have an effect on, for example, our muscle and our bone development or loss, we can also acknowledge that there are medical treatments to offset some of these hormonal changes. So, for example, if somebody has osteopenia, maybe they will take hormone supplements so that they can stay with osteopenia and not progress to full osteoporosis. I want to talk specifically about the main cognitive changes that we see in middle adulthood. And when I talked about before about how there wasn't much research in adulthood as far as cognitive psychosocial factors, there's one exception to that. The one area where there was tons and tons and tons of research was in cognitive, especially IQ development. And the clear finding as far as cognitive changes in adulthood is that there is a big difference between what we call fluid intelligence versus what we call crystallized intelligence. So fluid intelligence has to do with doing things quickly in sequence, multitasking. And this is what we see is something that peaks in early adulthood. As we talked about before, especially emerging adulthood, you see your highest, most efficient fluid intelligence, and then it drops. If we think about time test or working under the clock, working memory, how many things can you hold in your working memory at one time? Those are all very fluid intelligence things. So we see things like burning through pattern completion puzzles, one after another with very few errors. That shows a big draw on fluid intelligence. On the other hand, we have a different kind of intelligence called crystallized intelligence. And this is basically our explicit memories built up, vocabulary, memory of trivia, details, explicit memories of things that we've done. And basically, this increases or stays steady throughout adulthood, even in continuing into older or later adulthood. So things like our ABCs, our vocabulary, there's no reason, absent brain injury, for those things to decrease. Now, oftentimes, our measure of crystallized intelligence, how much of it we have, is dependent on the retrieval cues we are given. So as we age, the memory is still there, but perhaps it takes more retrieval cues to actually produce it or get it out of our brains. So I want to introduce a little neuroscience here so we can see, first of all, the volume of damage to a certain area of brain. And then we also, and specifically the cortex, and we see also the fluid intelligence. And we see that if we have more damage to the frontal lobe, we see that correlates with lower fluid intelligence, right? So we see that from this, there is a negative correlation, meaning the more damage, the lower the fluid intelligence in the frontal lobe. So we think that this area of the brain is important for fluid intelligence. How about this area of the brain? Well, we know, for example, the parietal lobe is very important for doing math problems, doing spatial processing, such as this example here. The greater the damage to this area, the lower the fluid intelligence. And this is also an important area of the brain for fluid intelligence. Now, this area of the brain, however, the temporal lobe, which is where we store lots of our explicit memories, things like language and vocabulary, you damage this area and it doesn't have an impact on fluid intelligence, right? So fluid intelligence seems to be represented in the frontal, parietal lobes, whereas crystallized intelligence seems to be represented more in the temporal lobes. Just wanted to throw out a few more examples so we're very clear on the difference between crystallized and fluid intelligence. Think about somebody who's older, right? I think about my own grandma, remembers a lot of details about who lived where, and she can go back to 80 years ago in terms of different people who lived in the neighborhood. Still has very strong verbal intelligence. And so crystallized intelligence is looking good. There's no brain damage, and so grandma is still pretty sharp. The one thing, though, it takes a little bit longer. Sometimes you ask her a question, and a second, 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds pass, still no answer. You think she's possibly not heard what you asked her, and then the answer comes out. So notice the information is still there, the memory is still there, but the efficiency, how long it takes to get it out, is increased with age. So things like Trivial Pursuit, Scrabble, are types of games that have a heavy draw on crystallized intelligence. And not surprisingly, older people probably enjoy playing these games better because they are better at them. On the other hand, we have fluid intelligence. This is, again, thinking quickly, the time pressure, abstractly. This is what decreases, right? So complex games, card games where you have to remember a lot of the cards which have been played or have not been played. You have to hold that in your memory. That's going to go down. Especially complex video games where you have to remember a lot of who's in what level and where are various people. That's going to go down. So driving, think of all the things you have to monitor while you're driving. How fast you're going, if you're staying in your lane, if you're tailgating someone else. And that's why fluid intelligence, if that decreases when you're older, you need to only focus on those things and not also be thinking about having a conversation, messing with your cell phone, listening to the radio. That negatively impacts everybody's driving, but even more so with people who are older and have less fluid intelligence. One more final way to think about the difference between crystallized and fluid intelligence. Crystallized or verbal scores stays relatively steady as we age, whereas fluid intelligence will drop. And we see here yet another manner of assessment or measurement of fluid intelligence, abstract pattern completion. As we age, we're going to be able to do fewer of these in a certain amount of time, and we'll make more errors as our fluid intelligence declines. And finally, I wanted to show you a classic example of how fluid intelligence is thought of in terms of what's important. How does it really relate to aging and efficiency and independence as we age? And here we see executive function. This is often something that we think about in terms of if someone's executive function is really declining, possibly they might not be able to live independently anymore. And if you want to measure this complex thing such as executive functioning, you can see a whole bunch of different tests that were used to measure it, right? So we won't go into all these, but a lot of these are computer tests where you're trying to answer a bunch of questions quickly. We see age. As we get older, negative correlation. As we get older, the executive function gets lower. And what is causing, if we break executive function down, what is causing this executive functioning? Well, it looks like crystallized intelligence, C here, crystallized, it does not have any impact on executive function. And we see it's heavily driven by, instead, this fluid intelligence. And so as our fluid intelligence goes down, it's really going to reduce our executive functioning. I also wanted to point out a way to measure fluid intelligence. I think it's really interesting how we measure these kinds of things. So here we have two sort of outcome measures. And again, we're doing pattern completion where you're flipping an image on its axis and then determining if it's the same or different, right? And we see it gets more complicated once we move to diagonals. So first of all, we have reaction times. How long does it take on average to come up with an answer? People with high fluid intelligence take less time, right, across the different axes of flipping. So this is more efficient because they're coming up with answers faster. We also see the error rates. How many are you getting wrong? Here's where we see the huge difference. Average IQ, yellow bar, is having much higher error rates. And the error rates are extremely high, especially the difference once we get to the more complex diagonal flipping tasks. Okay, let's transition into something that's less about measurement and more about the experience of what we see in people who are progressing through adulthood. One thing that we want to look at is what's called expertise. We all have kind of an intuitive or general idea of expertise. What does it look like in terms of more scientific? Basically, it's a very automatic and intuitive. So what this means is somebody who's been doing a job for 10 or more years has just seen a lot of situations. They've seen a lot of patterns, and they know what things are important in a given situation that they have expertise in, and they often also know what things to disregard, right? People who are early on the job might panic at something and see it as very important. Somebody who has expertise will say, oh no, I've seen this before, no need to panic, right? And oftentimes they aren't great at explaining exactly what they're looking for or looking at that drives their judgment. But their judgments tend to be better. So for example, looking at x-rays, detecting cancer, people who have done it for a lot of years will say, there's something about this x-ray that I don't like, right? So we're going to order further tests. Or for example, hearing an engine. I don't know. Sometimes I think my engine sounds weird, but it's nothing. So I want to run it past my stepdad, who always has an idea. And I'll say, can't you hear that? Can't you hear that sound that's off? I'll say, well, what does that mean? I don't know what I'm listening to. And they're not good at necessarily explaining why, but their experience sort of intuitively or automatically causes them to notice something that's different or something that they need to pay attention to. So this is a characteristic of post-formal thought, right? But it's a more intuitive, judgment, instinctive driven process. So it's related to this idea of encapsulation. So fluid abilities in problem solving, and specifically knowing the boundaries of problems, right? So if you've had a lot of experience engineering, you'll hopefully realize that your experience in engineering helps you with engineering problems, right? Or for example, business consulting. Somebody comes up with a proposal and you say right away, oh, that doesn't work, right? Now the key is encapsulation is very specific to the job or the sport that you've been playing. So what's dangerous is when somebody is successful in one type of industry and then says, oh, well, I'll be successful in other industries. Well, that's no guarantee. So we need to be careful about people who do have expertise in one area and then assume that their expertise will apply to other areas. The research does not support that. Another influential study is known as the Seattle Longitudinal Study. You don't have to remember these names, but K. Warner Shai is a huge influence, a big name in lifespan development research. Specifically, where do we have this big distinction between crystallized and fluid intelligence? Well, that came from the Seattle Longitudinal Study. What's interesting is it was a true longitudinal study. You start with people in early adulthood and then catch back up with them every 10 years or so. And then once you get to 50, 60 years later, true longitudinal study, most of those people are no longer available or alive in some cases, and so it has to end, right? A longitudinal study, even if it goes for 50 years, has to end, and that's what happened with the Seattle Longitudinal Study. What they found was there was no pattern of all intellectual abilities that applied equally. And what that means is if you take all intellectual abilities, they don't have the same pattern of change, which, no duh, we saw the difference between crystallized intelligence. Crystallized intelligence can stay steady, consistent, fluid intelligence will drastically go down. And that general finding is attributed mostly to Shy and colleagues, but others as well. We also found that in most, with the exception of fluid intelligence, psychometric abilities do not experience sharp decline. Again, the exception to that is fluid, but everything else, absent brain damage or super unhealthy physical conditions, there's no reason to expect huge cognitive decline. And we find some differences in cohorts. So, for example, later cohorts compared to earlier cohorts, the pattern of change is a little bit different. And maybe, for example, the rate of fluid intelligence decline is less in more recent cohorts, possibly because we're doing more living in an online computer-based environment that just requires us to tap into our fluid intelligence more often and keep it from declining as drastically as previous generations. What's happening relative to work and leisure? We have cohort differences, talking again about computer skills and abilities. More recent cohorts have more just comfort living their entire lives in an online world. We have the idea of what's known as a Protean career. So here we have Proteus, the shepherd of the sea. He could change his form to fit whatever situation he needed. And this is a more recent trend, opposite of the traditional 30 years and a gold watch with one organization and then retire. That is not the norm for more recent cohorts, where you have to focus on skill development and you expect to change jobs multiple times throughout your life. We also have the idea of work-life balance. What does a healthy work-life balance look like? Well, we can go way back in time to Sigmund Freud, and he was asked, what do you define as a well-adjusted adult? Instead of giving a long, complicated answer, he simply said to work and to love. And so for the normal adult, I think it's good to consider work-life balance, and especially in these times, to not overemphasize or to have too high of a work centrality to your overall identity. Another point I wanted to make is about religion and spirituality. And I am not going to focus on any one particular religion, but there's a lot of research to show that religious observers, this means somebody who, instead of somebody who just describes himself as spiritual, which means I don't go to church, I don't do any sort of daily prayer, I believe in God, that's not what this is, right? So religious observers are people who are behaving in a way that their religion tells them to. And of course, moderation in all things, but this means regular attendance at services. This means doing things such as volunteering. This means personal things such as meditation or prayer. We find if you're doing those things, on average, you tend to be healthier and you tend to feel less stress as an adult. So once again, I'm not telling you all to go to a specific church, but I am saying that engaging in these kinds of behaviors does have clear, documented from the research health benefits. I want to draw a comparison from Protean to traditional careers. Once again, traditional careers, linear, one company, vertical, climbing the ladder, right? And your company trains you. The Protean career, what we're finding now is you have to make your own connections and be responsible for your own development, be willing to move laterally between corporations, and a lot of the benefits are flexibility. And a lot of people want to have more flexibility in their employment than the previous model tend to emphasize. If we're talking about specifically getting a job, I've done a little research in this. This was my roommate for 5 years in grad school, and this was my advisor. But we were looking for specifically mature or age 55 plus job seekers. How were they different from the average job seeker? And so we got a sample of 173 mature job seekers, in this case over age 40. And we went to a job fair and got them to complete a survey. And what we found was that here were some of the job factors that we thought might be important to them, and more specifically, help to differentiate these 173 job seekers into different groups. And we found that there were some significant differences. So for example, these two groups on the end, satisficers and maximizers, were not looking for part-time, but those who were free agents did care about part-time. So this meant that if you were a part-time employer, you did have a subset of mature job seekers who would be looking for the job that you would offer. On the other hand, we see the maximizers here were different from the other groups on the job training, right? So maximizers really wanted that. The other two groups wanted significantly less. And so this basically goes to show that mature job seekers are not just one blob. They, in fact, can be separated based on what they're looking for into meaningful different groups. And so if you're an employer looking for looking for mature job seekers, you might want to think even more specifically about what kind of mature job seeker you're looking for and tailor your job posting for that specific group and not just for older workers. Also wanted to talk about the Erikson crisis. And again, it doesn't have to be a crisis. We have what's known as generativity versus stagnation. Of course, the movie Wild Hogs tends to emphasize the midlife crisis. This is very popular in the media and in pop culture. Levinson was the, I guess, researcher, I'm putting it a little bit loosely, the author, semi-scholar, pseudo-scholar, who came up with the idea of a midlife crisis 50 years ago. But it's probably in actuality rare. There's not much data to support the midlife crisis. So don't think that if you have a man who's in his 40s is going to lose his mind and divorce his wife and go buy a hot rod. That is very abnormal. It's also very male biased. You know, what happens with a female midlife crisis? And so instead of a midlife crisis, we have a midlife reevaluation and adjustment. So we call this a midlife review. And this is actually true. So once you cross into middle adulthood, a lot of the value, what gets you out of bed, what motivates you, is different from what motivated you in your 20s. And so this is the idea of generativity. This is not just trying to make money, trying to get a job, trying to get a car, right? Once you're in your 40s, you've probably achieved a lot of that, right? And so now it's leaving a legacy. A lot of times this involves family, but it certainly can also involve volunteering in organizations. It can involve being active in religious organizations. It can be, for example, leaving a legacy such as helping to create a park that people will enjoy in the future, right? And so the idea of generativity sounds very similar to me to the idea of self-actualization, which is a big part of positive or humanistic psychology, right? The idea that, okay, I'm past my basic needs, but I'm still not happy. And so now I need to climb that pyramid of needs. And this is the peak of the pyramid, right? This is you being your best self, the person you were meant to be. And it's taken most of your life to get through those other rungs of the pyramid to even have the chance to make this journey to the top. Also wanted to talk about one of the very first longitudinal studies. This was done by George Valent from Harvard back then College. It's not a great study from our current perspective, but it laid the groundwork of what was possible for a longitudinal study, right? You got to start somewhere, and this was one of the first really, I guess, high-profile longitudinal studies. So basically, it's based on the normative stage perspective, basically looking for human universals. The problem is, if you're only including Harvard College men and 268 of them, that's not a sample that includes human universals, right? Small sample, probably high socioeconomic status, and only including one gender, right? So this was their goal. The sample did not achieve the goal that they were going for. But they were looking for basic social factors across the lifespan, and how did that influence their identity and how they ended up, right? So get data from them when they're in college. follow up with them longitudinally later on in adulthood. And they found, well, they used the type model here. Once they're in adulthood, they categorize them as either happy, sad, or dead. So we would do a lot better today in terms of personality and outcome variables. What they did find was that money generally didn't matter. And of course, if you're getting a Harvard degree, chances are you're going to be okay. But what they found is that people who made a ton of money did not meaningfully differ in terms of whether they were in one of these categories from people who just made a good income, middle class income. What they did find was, not surprisingly, but we need data to support it, happy older adults were the ones who were not smoking, were not abusing alcohol. So again, very, very simple findings. It was not a complex study, but for its time, it was ambitious because you're committing longitudinally to catching up with this sample 30, 40 years later. And of course, we can make a quick joke, basically that just because you're male and entering early adulthood, there is no expectation that they're going to go through the midlife crisis. Maybe a more mild midlife review, but we would not expect a crisis for most people. Also, we can look at middle adulthood, perhaps the midlife review, as maybe a reconnection to something in childhood that you used to have. And so, again, we don't want to punish people for exploring possibly new identities or maybe a little slight changes to their identity. That's okay. But certainly if this guy decided to leave his job, leave his family, and just go hike across the Appalachian Trail, then that would be a problem. Finally, I wanted to introduce you to one last study. I promise this will be the last one. We have what's known as the Baltimore Longitudinal Study on Aging, right? And so a couple things to keep in mind. With each study, I just want you to remember one important thing. So we have the Seattle Longitudinal Study that was about crystallized versus fluid intelligence changes. We have the Valent study from Harvard. That was the first big longitudinal study, right? We have the Midas. This was looking at psychosocial factors, emotional factors on aging. What's the unique additional factor that the Baltimore longitudinal study adds? Well, this was, you don't have to know these names for exam purposes, but if we talk about the Big Five model of personality traits, Costa and McRae were the ones driving it. And a lot of the data that they got was from the Baltimore longitudinal study on aging. So they gave tons of these Big Five personality tests to people of all ages, but especially following them longitudinally, and came up with some general findings. So as we age, openness to experience generally declines a little bit. We're not going out and learning how to kayak when we're 60 or skydive. But conscientiousness or dependability, responsibility does increase. I think that makes sense. But in general, despite these changes, they believe they found remarkable stability. I put this in quotes because they had some bias. They wanted to establish their Big Five as the one and only or best model of personality. It's the biggest, most popular one, most well-known, but I don't think it's as stable as they say it is, which means maybe the Big Five is good for some parts of adulthood, but maybe there's other models of personality that are better to use, for example, for later adulthood. But that's a big high-level nerd fight that I'll spare you from. Just want to show visually how these personality dimensions might change over time. And we have from adolescence all the way moving longitudinally toward retirement age. And what we see is clearly conscientiousness, blue, has a steady increase, or dependability, responsibility as we age. The other clear change that we see is neuroticism goes way down. So this means if maybe somebody, a friend or family member of yours, is neurotic in their teens, by their early 20s, they should start naturally reducing some of that neuroticism or neurotic behavior. Also, agreeableness tends to go up a little bit, not drastically. And we see openness to experience tends to rise a little bit in adolescence, which makes sense. And then once we get to older adulthood, definitely drop down. Not huge, but a little bit. So as we start to wrap things up, let's look at some generational issues. We already talked about marriage and the value of a strong marriage. Now that we are in middle adulthood, probably the marriage was started a decade or more ago. Not in all cases, but most cases. Marriages that last are those that tend to be higher quality. And this builds up sort of like our savings or investment analogy. We can also apply it to marriage. Marital capital. Once a marriage lasts past that, typically we view it as a 5-year magic mark. Once you hit that 5-year mark, the prediction is that the marriage is generally going to last. And those that do increase in quality, and both members in general will experience the increased physical and psychological health that comes with a strong marriage. We also have the empty nest. I probably wouldn't call it a syndrome, but it has been used before, so I'm going with it. The empty nest condition, in which parents have to adjust after having spent a decade plus bringing up their kids, and now their kids leave the nest, leaving it empty. But usually it's a sad time for 6 months of adjustment and exploration, and then most normal parents will adjust with that fairly healthily. Of course, then the issue can be you finally adjust to your new situation of empty nest, and now you've got your kids boomeranging back from college. This is why everybody talks about the economy and jobs being so important, to reduce, in part, the stress from the boomerang generation coming back. We also have the sandwich generation, right? So basically, compared to 50, 60 years ago, now we're living longer, and now kids are more likely to remain in the house or come back to the house. So this is a recipe potentially for stress for those in middle adulthood, right? You have to take care of your parents who are aging, living longer, but possibly in ill health. And you also have to take care again of your kids who you thought may have entered adulthood and independence, but for various reasons, maybe now you do have to come back and take care of them as well. What we do find is that there are buffers against this kind of stress. Education, it's not this magic going to fix it, but we know that on average, the higher education level you have tends to result in less stress for these family issues. And also, again, marriage, especially a strong marriage that is built on a foundation and has lasted for a decade plus, is going to be a buffer for the stress in the event that you experience the sandwich. And as we wrap things up, again, if you're an empty nester and you're trying to avoid the boomerang, maybe you can just sell the house, pick up a fake ID, false identity, and start a new life. And finally, we don't want to joke about it too much, but if we think about generativity versus isolation, deadbeat is the extreme form of isolation. And of course, someone who has left very little legacy, shown very little generativity. I imagine people in this situation in middle adulthood will experience lots of regret, and the clock is ticking for them to reverse this trend and still make some sort of contribution or lasting legacy. Okay, thank you for hanging in there. This wraps up Chapter 8. We will continue next time with the final chapter, Chapter 9, Late or Old Adulthood.